There we go. Now we can see what's going on.
You now have 30 seconds.
Okay.
30 seconds.
Well, I can see it now.
That's right. And when you see your picture,
I'll start. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Good evening. Whoop. Good evening, and welcome to our author series at UUTC. I'm Jim Hardy. Our guest this evening is the Reverend Dr. Carter Heyward, internationally known Episcopal priest, professor, theologian, activist, and writer. She holds a master's degrees from Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary, and a PhD in systematic theology from Union. She was the Howard Chandler Robbins Professor of Theology at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts from 1975 until her retirement in 2006. In 1998, she received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the Union Theological Seminary. She's the author of 16 books, with a 17th to be released this summer. As I read Carter's latest book, Tears of Christepona, I realized a 1-hour interview could not do justice to either the woman or her work. Carter graciously agreed to talk with me for the next 2 hours or so. We'll take a short break around the middle of our interview, and for those of you who can't devote the entire time this evening, be assured that the interview is being recorded and will be available on both YouTube and Facebook for viewing at your convenience. Carter Heyward, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our UUTC author series.
Thank you, Jim.
In the prologue to Tears of Christepona, you write about the difficulty in 1982 of finding a publisher for your second book on the radically mutual rationality at the core of God. I was told, you write, and I quote, that it was too Christian for non-Christians and not Christian enough for Christians, too feminist for non-feminists and not feminist enough for feminists, too academic for a popular readership and not academic enough for religious scholars. In the preface to your next book, to be published this summer, The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, A Call to Action, you describe yourself as, and again I quote, a politically progressive white Christian American woman in my late 70s, an Episcopal priest who identifies these days as a Universalist Christian. You continue, I've written, taught, preached, and spoken publicly as a lesbian feminist theologian for most of the last 50 years. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's begin at the beginning. You grew up in North Carolina, in western North Carolina, living in both Charlotte and just a few miles from here in Hendersonville. Please tell us a little bit about those early years and what part they played in shaping your theology and your passion for human rights.
Great, Jim. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, friends, for having me here. This is quite an honor to be able to be asked these questions and to be given a chance to respond. I was born in Charlotte in 1945, just as World War II was ending, and my father, in fact, was still overseas. He was on Okinawa, and he didn't see me till I was 6 months old. And he and my mother moved to Hendersonville with me when I was 2, and I'm told that their primary reason for leaving was the polio epidemic, which was at the time quite a problem, particularly in the cities. And so they moved to Hendersonville, where my dad, who was a salesman for Esso, later Exxon, got a job that became his base. And so I grew up really right down the road in Hendersonville for about 10 years. And I guess those 10 years to me were the most formative years of my life up until very recently. I was an only child for 6 years. I spent most of my time, much as possible, out of doors. I had an imaginary playmate because I was really the only child around anywhere, except for my imaginary playmate, who was a little colored girl. Her name was Sophie Couch. And Sophie Couch and I went sort of everywhere together, and my mother even set a place at the table for her. I think it's fair to say that even though she was a figment of my imagination, it was through that imaginary playmate that I first began to think about colored people and white people. Why did I have a little colored playmate? I don't really know, other than that it had dawned on me by the time I was 3 or 4 that we were living in a society that was divided according to race, and that there were these colored people. I'm sure you all know that at that time that's what black people, African Americans, were called by those of us who were white here. And so I was aware of the divisions between black and white people. I didn't understand them. By the time I was 6 or 7, I was asking my parents about them, and they didn't know what to say other than it was not God's will. I do remember that part. And when I said, why doesn't God do something about it? And they would, and I'd say, why don't we do something about it? And they'd say, there's not much we can do, except we can pray and we can be kind to everybody. That was the kind of upbringing I had. But anyhow, to bring this first part to a little close, I retired in the mountains of North Carolina because I think by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, these mountains were really in my soul. And I had always known that wherever I went in the world, whatever I did, I wanted to come back to North Carolina at the end and be here. And so here I am. And we'll talk more about, I'm sure this will come up again and again.
Sure. I'm curious to know, you talked about your imaginary playmate, who obviously played an important part in your life for quite a while.
Yes.
Did you have other playmates? Did you have a circle of friends that you played with normally?
I had a few friends, yes, and they were they were children of my parents' friends. And we got together as much as we could, but they lived in other parts of Hendersonville, and so we lived I've been to see the house where we lived, and it's this little itty-bitty house. Of course, I thought it was huge, you know how that is. And it had a creek running behind it. It had a big flower field in front of it. It had woods on one side, an apple orchard on another side. And so that's where my imaginary playmate, Sophie, and I would hang out in the apple trees or crawling around through the fields. And yes, I had a couple of good friends who were about my age who would come over and play with me too. So I was not entirely alone, but spent a good bit of time by myself.
You've devoted your life to religion and to religious thought. How much of a part did religion play at your home growing up?
Well, my parents, I always described them as not exactly conservative white Southerners, but they certainly were not very liberal in most of their outlooks, but they were conventional. I mean, they believed they were very kind. I mean, kindness would be that's the way I would first describe my parents. Kind, very, very kind people, kind to me, kind to each other, and kind to everybody that I could tell. And we had family prayer every single day at breakfast, and that would be, somebody would pray, one of my parents, and some Bible verse would be read, and there was never a hint of fundamentalism. I mean, I never heard anything about you only believe what's in the Bible, or the Bible means what it says and you better do it. And none of that. It was read to me as a book filled with interesting stories, whether it was Moses and the bulrushes or Jesus and the disciples, it was, and it never occurred to me, literalism, fundamentalism, none of that had any role to play in my childhood. My mother had 2 Methodist ministers Methodist bishops as grandfathers. My father was from a Presbyterian family in South Carolina, And they went to St. James Episcopal Church in Hendersonville because they liked the ivy. And so that's why I became an Episcopalian. It's because of the ivy on the church. And my father, and these days I'm actually speaking at one of the Presbyterian churches in Hendersonville, and I told these lovely Presbyterians just Sunday that the story about the ivy, but I said I realized that my father, growing up as a Presbyterian, the one thing I remember him kind of moaning about when he had to go to church was communion, because he said Presbyterians just don't take communion all the time. You know, they take it at Christmas and they take it at Easter and they take it from time to time, but, you know, Presbyterians just don't always go to communion, and I don't know why we have to do that. So I remember that my father didn't usually complain, but he did complain about how many times Episcopalians had to take communion. But that was, but we did go to church every Sunday, and I remember loving going to church. I loved the quietness of it. I loved the stained glass windows. I loved the Bible stories. I loved that felt board that children had, that we could, you know, have the wise men and the sheep and whatever, and, you know, and the baby Jesus and all of that. I remember the tactile part of being a child in church.
Was one of your parents more dominant than the other, or one that you feel you connected with more than the other?
Not really. My mother was more outgoing. My father was more retiring. I think as I became older, my father and I probably became closer, although my father died in 1984 and my mother not until 2009, and in the last 25 years or so of her life, she and I became extremely close. So it was interesting. After Daddy died, Mama and I became very close friends.
Okay. You grew up at a time when women's roles and gender identity were rigidly and narrowly defined. Mm-hmm. Tell about your own awakening to these issues and how that growing awareness has influenced your life and your theology.
Well, there too, I don't think the issue of my gender as a female was, on the one hand, it was never an issue that I knew. I mean, I did what I wanted to do. I was what would have been certainly called a tomboy. I loved running around and barefooted with only a pair of shorts on, catching crawfish in the creek and playing with the animals. And I was very interested in playing ball and riding a bike as I got older, and doing things that girls and boys did. And I didn't really, and my parents were fine with that. And of course, the fact that they named me Carter, which is a very androgynous name for a girl child, sort of put me kind of, I didn't think much about gender. It didn't bother me, it didn't excite me, it didn't do anything to me. I liked dolls. I preferred baby dolls to bride dolls. But I also really liked trucks and building, you know, like blocks. And so I was a pretty androgynous kid. Where gender issues began to really hit me was in pre-adolescence and early adolescence. By the time I was 11 or 12, and by that time we were back in Charlotte, I had been taking horseback riding lessons when I was like 9, 10 years old, and I loved that. But my family really couldn't afford to let me keep doing that, and so they told me that it was just too expensive a hobby for them to allow me to keep doing it. And so they said, "Why don't you take dancing lessons instead?" Well, I thought, oh, okay. And I hated dancing lessons. I really did not like it, and I felt totally out of my element. I didn't feel like I could dance. I felt like I was not pretty enough for boys to like. I would not be chosen when boys got to choose girls, which again, because of the way things were, it was always the boys get to choose the girls to dance with, and I would get left out much of the time. I was also taller than all the boys. I was as tall at age 11 or 12 as I am now. I was not very tall, but and for a child, it was pretty tall. Anyhow, so I felt awkward and uncomfortable being a female, being socialized as a girl, as a teenage girl. I didn't exactly want to be a boy, but I did not like this sex role business at all. Not at all, still don't.
When did you start to realize that you were, your sexual orientation?
Not until I didn't think much about that. I didn't know that was even an option, to be honest, until I was probably in college, definitely not in high school. In college, I had crushes on girls and women teachers, but I also had crushes on some boys and male teachers. So again, I was kind of bisexual, and but I was not sexual at all. I had, in that sense, I had really ingested sort of my Christian upbringing. And this is where my parents were very conventional and conservative in terms of just sex is something you don't do until you're married. So it never dawned on me to even move in that direction with a boy or a girl until I was in college, and we began to kind of talking about it some. I went to Randolph Macon Women's College, so we're all females. So we did begin to talk about, we'd never used the word lesbian, but no question, many of the girls that I knew had lesbian feelings or same-sex attractions. And I don't know whether others acted on them. I really did not until after college.
Well, you've been very open about your sexual orientation, and I'm curious to know, because at the time you're talking about, people just didn't talk about that.
No.
If they didn't conform to the normal
Right.
Gender roles, sexual roles, they were in the closet.
Right.
Did you feel that pressure, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I felt that pressure. No, I didn't feel it terribly. It never, ever crossed my mind that I would be rejected by my parents, for example. That was never an issue, but I had no idea what might happen if I did tell anybody, really, parents, teachers, anybody, that I had a sexual attraction to another girl, or that I had a crush on my sociology teacher who was a female, or I didn't have a language for that. I think when you don't know that lesbianism is a possibility, it's almost like it's not even a word that makes sense. It's like, I don't know what I am. And I don't know what all these feelings are, So it's like, I was just really confused in terms of, and it was not so much confusion about sexual identity. I think I would have been just as confused were I very, very straight. I just didn't know what to do or think about sexuality, period, when I was 15, 16, 17, 18. By the time I came out, really came out, that is to say, I began to make it part of my public persona. I was in my late 20s, and it was after the ordination in Philadelphia. I had been out by the time I was ordained, which was when I was to the priesthood, which is when I was 28. I had been out for a number of years to my friends and to my family. I told my parents the first time I got involved with a girl, and I wanted to take her home for a vacation, and so I told my parents, and they were not thrilled. But they said she could come. They did not, they really didn't like it much. They said we could not sleep in the same bedroom, but they were very polite and nice. They were very nice Southern people. They were very nice to her and welcoming, but they really did not want to deal with the sex part of that at all. But my friends and I, my own peers and I, including other women who were seeking ordination, we were very forthcoming with each other about being lesbian or bisexual or straight by the time we were in our, say, mid-20s, early 20s, mid-20s.
So you were, obviously your parents, they didn't like it,
Yeah.
but but they didn't actively oppose it, like kicking you out
Oh,
of the
no,
house or anything.
no, and they turned, it's important to say, they turned to the priest of our church, who was a very good friend of theirs. This was in Charlotte. He was also a friend of mine, and he had been very supportive of the irregular ordination that we'll talk about in a little while, I'm sure. But he really did not know how to, when they turned to Bart to ask him what they should do about the fact that I had come to them to talk about being a lesbian, he didn't know what to do. He was totally unhelpful. He didn't say that they should kick me out. And in fact, he knew that they would continue to love me, and he supported that, but he was anything but helpful when it came to trying to connect them up with other people who might have gay and lesbian children, or with to point out that I was not the only child, teenager, young woman in that congregation who was lesbian or gay. And I don't think he even knew. I don't think people were talking about it. This was the 60s, and it was like nobody had a language for this.
You've been an advocate for people, gays, but also for people of color.
Yes.
For women.
Right.
Feminism. Is part of that tied up in all of this experience?
My father, when I came out as a lesbian, he said, you're just for the underdog. You're always for the underdog. He said, I'm not even sure I believe that you're a lesbian, because they said, whatever it is, if it's an underdog, you're going to say that's what you are. And I just remember that. I remember exactly where we were standing in the house when he said that to me in Charlotte. It was like, come on, you always have to be on the side of the people who don't have any power.
So that's a really telling comment.
Yeah, it was.
About, this goes back way before your sexual issues, identity, and so on. I mean, obviously.
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, in high school and earlier on, I'd been troubled about more about race issues than gender issues. I didn't think about gender issues until, as I said, I hated sex roles so much as a teenager. But I still wasn't thinking about women as really oppressed people. I was not able to get a handle on that when I was like 15. But by the time I would say 8, 9, 10, I did know that there was something bad the matter in terms of race in our society, and I hated that, and I wanted somebody to do something about it. And I would certainly talk to my parents about it, and they agreed, basically. They just didn't know what to do. They never tried to talk me out of it. They just said, we don't know what to do. And they, when Dr. King came onto the scene, and when Rosa Parks, this would have been when I was 9, 10, 11 years old. They thought Rosa Parks and they thought Martin Luther King were good. I mean, they were very glad they were doing what they were doing. And this was in the South, although I think it scared them. And I think my father didn't quite get it exactly. He liked Dr. King. He admired him, but he also thought that King brought unnecessary trouble on himself. Sure. Maybe he should just calm down a little bit.
Well, he was upsetting the whole social order.
That's right, because trouble always follows him. I remember that line too. Trouble goes wherever Dr. King goes, trouble goes. Like this is Dr. King's fault. And my father knew better than that. But I mean, but Dad and I and my mother and I would all go around about this, and they were pretty much on the side of justice.
At the age of 16, you were elected chair of Episcopal Young Churchmen, and I underline churchmen,
yeah.
in the Diocese of North Carolina, and were active in pressing the diocese toward integration of its summer camp. Mm. Was this the beginning of your role as an activist?
Yeah, I would say that's as much the beginning as any I can think of. But I was 16, and that's right, I was the chair of the Youth Commission in the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of North Carolina, which is not Western Carolina. It's the Raleigh, Charlotte, Piedmont strip. And for the first time ever, a black kid was elected to the Youth Commission. And the Youth Commission always met at Veda Mecum, which was a church camp up near Winston-Salem. And the bishop of the diocese contacted me, since I was the chair, and said, you can't meet there this year because it's not integrated. And this was 1962. And so the other kids and we were 15, 16, 17 years old, we wrote back and forth, and we did some phone calls, and we decided that we could not accept that response from the bishop. So we let the bishop know that this was unacceptable to us, and that the church, of all institutions, the church needed to do something to change that. And the bishop said, well, something's in process, but the charter, it is segregated by charter, and we have to do something legal in order to be able to integrate the camp. And we can't do that just like that. We have to take the time. And we said, no, that's not acceptable. We have to do it now. And so the bishop disbanded us. And that bishop, that is the very same bishop that turned me down for ordination about nine years later. And I remember and this was as a deacon. Women could be deacons when this bishop turned me down. And in the Episcopal Church, you're ordained a deacon and then a priest. But you have to be ordained a deacon first. And in those days, women were being ordained deacons. When I went to Bishop Fraser, Tom Fraser, and seeking ordination as a deacon, he turned me down, and his reason was that I had an authority problem. And I thought, probably so.
Your authority problem was that you weren't intimidated by authority, right?
Well, some things don't change, right?
I want to come back to that in just a minute.
Yeah, right.
But I want to talk about your path toward being a priest. And many who enter the religious life say that it's a calling, that they were this special calling. Did you feel that? What led you in that direction?
Yeah, I would say there were two distinct parts of what I believed I was doing when I began to seek ordination as a priest. And one was an authentic sense that as the priesthood, as I understood it, and as I understand it still to this day, at its best, is a vocation, that is kind of a life journey job, that is rooted in helping everybody to discover that we're all priests. And the priest is the mediator between the human and the divine, and we're all in that same role if we're living good lives, in my opinion, leaving aside the language of it, that somehow we're all in this together and we all represent God to one another and one another to God. And that's what the priest does, as I understand the priesthood. So I have believed that ever since I began thinking about these things as a teenager. So that was the theological, the sort of the spiritual theological call. There was a political side to this too, however, and that was that because women could not be ordained, it was imperative that as many of us as possible get together and try to do something about that and change that. Because how outrageous was it that women could not be ordained in the Episcopal Church? And I had really begun to be mindful of that in seminary. When I went to Union Seminary out of college, I had majored in religion at Randolph-Macon Women's College, went to seminary, and I didn't go there to be ordained. I went there to study religion. But I got there, and there were other women there who were seeking ordination, including Episcopalians, and we couldn't be ordained because we were women. We could be ordained deacons, but not priests. So it was that twofold. It was very definitely a spiritual component to it, but also a political component. It was a movement that I felt extremely important to join that movement.
And I think that combination of political and spiritual has been the foundation of all of your work.
I think that's right. It's always both.
Yeah. Tell us about the Philadelphia 11.
Oh, well, I've just, on Saturday, I saw a film, a 90-minute documentary that's being made right now about the Philadelphia 11 that will be shown for our 50th anniversary in 2 years. And so the filmmakers were passing it by, the six of us who were still alive, and then a couple of other women who were ordained very, very soon after. But and so that's been very much in my mind as we've all talked to each other very, very recently. I think the Philadelphia 11 were 11 women deacons who believed they had vocations, we had vocations as priests, and were being blocked only by the church's refusal to ordain women on the same basis as men. We ranged in age from about 27 or 28. I was among the youngest four. There were four of us who were 27 or 28 to 78. Jeanette Picard was a woman, some of you I'm sure know who she was. She was a remarkable woman who had been with her husband into the stratosphere in a balloon in earlier years. And she was a scientist, and she was also a theologian and wanted to be ordained a priest. So we had young ones, an old one, and a number of women who were in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And we didn't know several of us had known each other in seminary, but apart from that, we didn't know each other at all until we became part of this group that was seeking ordination. And in 1970, we had the Episcopal Women's Caucus, which was women seeking ordination, and our friends had formed. The church had turned down women's ordination in Houston, Texas. And 3 years later at the Triennial Convention in 1973, the church turned it down in Louisville by an even larger margin. So we realized that things were not moving in a direction that was positive or that was hopeful, and several bishops agreed with us, and lots of laymen and women agreed. And so a bunch of us got together right after the Louisville Convention in 1973 and decided that we needed to do something that would break open this situation, and that the only thing that we could imagine would be to go ahead and have an ordination of women, despite the church's refusal to admit women to the priesthood. And so 3 bishops agreed to ordain any women who were ready to be ordained. And there were 40 of us who theoretically could have been ordained at that point, 40 deacons, but 11 of us, for a variety of reasons, 11 of us presented ourselves to be ordained. So that's what we were, the Philadelphia 11. And so we were ordained in the summer of 1974, about 9 months after the convention had turned down women priests.
Did your ordination stand with the Episcopal hierarchy?
Not at the time. They immediately met the bishops, House of Bishops, and declared it invalid, and they censured their brother bishops for having done this thing. And they told us that we could not function in any way in any Episcopal church, and so most churches did not have us come. 2 did, a church in Washington, D.C., and a church in Oberlin, Ohio, invited several of us to come and preside at the Eucharist, which is what priests do. And that's what distinguishes a priest from everybody else, is that the priests are the ones who are authorized to celebrate the communion in the Episcopal system. So you have to, if you're going to somehow show that you really are a priest, you go and you celebrate the communion, and somebody stands up and objects or something, which this became fairly routine for a couple of years. As we would go, people would have us come into their homes and have house Eucharists, and those were great. And they were illegal, but who cared? I mean, it was the people of the church, not just Episcopalians, but all kinds of people, particularly Roman Catholics, who thought this was the greatest thing ever to have these women priests out there like circuit riders. But then we did these 2 public ones, and the men who had us come, the male priests who invited us, they're the ones who got taken to trial by the bishops, because to have taken us to trial would have been to legitimize the ordinations. So they took the men to trial, and in both cases suspended them. And one of them later became a clinical psychologist and worked as a psychologist for the rest of his profession. And the other one became the head of a burial society in D.C., doing green burials, basically. And but they both had to leave parish ministry because they had invited women to preach.
When was your priesthood accepted by the...
In 1976, 2 years later. So, and there are those who argue to this day that it would have happened without the Philadelphia ordination, and there are those who say it never would have happened without it. So we'll never know. But what we tried to do, because there was an ordination the next year as well, in 1975, of 4 women, also irregular, and that the second ordination was to put a punctuation mark, an exclamation point after the first ordination that this will keep happening, whether the church authorizes it or not. Women will be priests in an ongoing way. And so we, one of my sister priests had said, she was a fabulous community organizer, and she said, the church is never going to ordain women officially until it's harder not to than to. And I think that was probably very, very true.
But I think you paved the way for mainstream Protestant denominations, right?
Well, no, the most Protestant churches had been ordaining women for quite a while.
Okay.
And as you know, the Roman Catholic Church still doesn't.
Right.
And the Anglican Church split open because of this. And there's the Anglicans, in fact, there's an Anglican church here in Brevard, St. Patrick's, that does not have women priests, and another one in Mills River. So all over the United States, there are former Episcopal churches that don't ordain women, that went their own way. And then the church split again about gay stuff. So we've had many, schisms in the Episcopal world.
Okay. You clearly are a rabble-rouser and activist, and yet you taught at the Episcopal Seminary in
Right.
Cambridge for 31 years, and actually started there, I think, right after you were
Right.
your
Right.
ordination was recognized. So I'm guessing that some of the positions that you've taken over the years have ruffled some feathers, both in and out of the Episcopal establishment. Tell us a little bit about that and how you were able to keep your tenure there for 31 years.
Well, first of all, I've just got to say the Episcopal Divinity School that hired two of us, Sue Hyatt and myself, in 1975 was just this remarkable institution, headed up by two men at the time who basically put their own vocations on the line in order to hire us. So that they said they would not continue on as deans. They were co-deans at the time of a merged seminary. They would not continue on as the heads of the seminary unless the seminary hired women priests immediately. So there weren't that many people to choose from, you see, when they chose two of us. So, and in many ways, then I just lucked out. I lucked into a job. I didn't know whether or not I really wanted to teach theology for the rest of my professional life. I found out that I loved it. I enjoyed that very much. But Sue Hyatt, my colleague, and I sort of went there not knowing whether or not we were going to be there very long. But the seminary, for the most part, was extraordinarily supportive of us for all these decades. There were a few of our male colleagues who were not. They did not like that we had been hired. They voted against us. But they were in the minority. And occasionally some male, and if you can imagine it, female students would come who did not believe in women's ordination. And they could be pretty challenging for us. But for the most part, the vast majority of the students, men and women, were very supportive. And the seminary, when we were in trouble with bishops or whomever, it was usually because the seminary itself was, because the seminary, the Episcopal Divinity School, was really on the cutting edge of the Episcopal Church until it shut down its Cambridge campus just very recently and joined Union Seminary in New York, more or less merged with Union Seminary about 5 years ago, which says something about EDS. If you know Union Seminary at all, it's a very progressive Protestant seminary. But the Episcopal Divinity School was an excellent place to be, and I didn't ruffle many feathers of people at EDS.
So you were free to be, you were intellectually
We were free. Intellectually, I mean, it was really a very privileged and it was not a hard place at all to be. It was a very, it was a great place to study and teach liberation theologies, including feminist and queer, and to travel to places like Nicaragua and go all over the place, go all over the world, meeting with other liberation theologians and work with black theologians. And the seminary was saying, go for it. Yeah.
I'd like to turn now to theology a little bit.
Yeah.
And of course, central to Christian theology is the definition of God and humans' relationship to God. how do you define God, and has that definition changed over the years?
It's become more universalist, for sure. To me, let's go back to this childhood in Hendersonville. I saw a picture of myself once as a 5-year-old looking at a box turtle on the ground. And when I was writing one of these books 5 years or 10 years ago or whatever, I used that image to talk about God and the God that was in that box turtle. And that somehow I knew at age 5 that that box turtle had every bit as much God in it as I did in me. That there was something about the created world as well as humans that had God in them somehow. And I've always believed that. And the older I have gotten, the more agency I believed God has, or power to move the struggles for justice, for sure, and for liberation of all peoples, and also in nature itself. And truly, I cannot imagine how it works, but I do believe that there is a power for connection. I believe physicists understand this better than most theologians. Maybe not all physicists, but some physicists understand this better than most theologians, that everything is connected, and that what I would call God is the connecting link. The God is the spirit that connects us, every one of us here and everybody who's not here, and we'll never ever be able to begin to imagine ways in which our lives are connected. But that to me is God. And the anthropomorphic imagery we use, the father, mother, lover, sister, brother, all of that it's like poetry. It can be helpful in terms of liturgically it can be helpful. Relationally it can be helpful. If I notice God in you and experience God then kind of as a brother, that can be a helpful way to me of respecting who you are. But I don't take that literally. It's not that I believe that God is therefore this male sitting beside me.
That stereotypical picture of an old man with a white beard.
Sitting on a right, or with this literal son who, has on sandals and has a beard, who's walking around. That is all very sort of poetic and metaphorical, and it's about stories and art and music. But it doesn't make God any less real. So, okay. And I've gotten more that way as I've gotten older.
And you use the term universalist Christian. What does that mean?
It means that I believe it means that the Jesus story is extremely important to me. It has been from the beginning. It continues to be. I know Christian language. I know the Christian symbolism. I am, in many ways, sort of an irredeemable Christian. I've just got Christianity in my bones, just like I have that turtle in my bones. But not for 1 second do I believe that Christians are any closer to God or have any better understanding of God or any better people or any better anything than the rest of humankind. And therefore, I love the universalism that is embodied in this congregation. I think that, whatever God is or isn't, we Christians, we Unitarians, we Lutherans, we Catholics, we Jews, we Sikhs, whatever, none of us has a monopoly on understanding that.
The thing that splits believers from non-believers seems to be the divinity of Christ. And John 3:16. That the only way to get to heaven is by believing in the divinity of Jesus. And I assume you don't.
I do not. Not in any literal sense, any more than I believe all of us are God bearers and all of us. If we're going to use the term Christ, I usually talk about Christic power, but Christ is the body of Christ, as is often talked about in the Christian churches, is all of us, I mean, it's everybody. It's the earth. I mean, it's not Jesus, and it's certainly not in a piece of bread that's being broken. It's very, there again, that's metaphor, that's poetry.
You begin, the first sentence of the prologue to Tears of Christepona states, I gave my life to Christ when I was 14 at a Billy Graham rally.
I did.
What's happened since then?
Well, I somehow giving my life to Christ at a Billy Graham rally and also being a debutante. These are two moments in my life that I just sat up and say, well, life is, I'm glad it's often, or sometimes in my case, a long life, because I can do these things and still recover. Billy Graham and my father played golf together.
Really?
Billy Graham was from Charlotte,
yes.
and Montreat as well, but he is, I didn't know him personally well at all, but I saw him occasionally, and I thought he was a really very handsome man, very nice man. I did, and my parents did too. They thought Billy Graham was just fine. And he was, in a personal way. I mean, I think it's systemically, Billy Graham was a problem. I see this now. Is because I see white Christian nationalism as a systemic problem, and that's what this other book is about. And Billy Graham was part of that. As a person who would have been a very nice neighbor to any of us, he would have been great. He's a very nice guy, and I think he was a much lovelier person and easier going person and more accepting person than, for example, his son is. His son Franklin, I mean. I don't know how many other children he has. But we can't, I mean, I think we have to think about what goes on among Christians critically from a systemic perspective and not just personal. And when I gave my life to Christ as a 14-year-old, I was swept off my feet by this very charismatic evangelist.
As were millions of other people.
It was like, everything he was saying made so much sense to me, and why not? This is a good thing, and yeah.
Just out of curiosity, how did your father and Billy Graham cross paths?
I guess at a golf club in Charlotte.
It's a golf club.
Yeah,
okay.
my father loved playing golf,
Okay.
and I don't know whether Billy Graham belonged to the club or whether he was a guest there or what, but they were not regular golf buddies, but I just remember hearing about this.
Okay. I'd like to go to the book now, Tears of Christepona, and it's quite a read, and it begins a really political discussion and look at politics as they exist today,
Right.
and our world as it exists
Right.
today. But I'd like to start off with Christepona. Where did that come from?
Christepona. Well, as I say early on in this book, that most people who know me, who start reading the first pages of this book would say, that's just more of what I've always said. It's true. There's nothing particularly new about this book until suddenly there's Christepona. Christepona is an image that came to me as I began to think about writing this book, who basically, Christepona said, you need to write this book, or you need to write this down. She or they is what in more traditional Christian language would be like a representative group of people from the communion of saints, or the community of those who've gone on before, animals as well as humans, who both people and creatures that I've known, and probably people and creatures that I haven't known, but the voices that I recognize in Christepona are people that have been extremely important to me in my life, like my former partner Beverly Harrison, who was herself a feminist Christian social ethicist, and my parents, both of my parents, and my theological mentor Dorothea Zola. My first most beloved horse, Red, is right there with them. Sister Angela, who was an Anglican mystic that I met back in 1991 when I went to Australia on a feminist workshop. and wound up at her monastery. Anyhow, these spirits, all of these people have died. These people have died, but somehow I was feeling down and out in the fall of 2019. I had just learned, well, Donald Trump was president, so that's got to be the backdrop to everything. And so I was dealing with what everybody in this room was dealing with, and what people all over the world have been and are to this day dealing with. So that was a part of the problem. More personally, my horse, Feather, this is my horse Red's daughter. Feather was my very beloved pet horse, had just been diagnosed with a horrific equine cancer that was barely known by veterinarians. It was so rare, but it was terminal. And when I was visiting her at the vet's farm down in Tryon, I fell and broke my arm. So we have the political situation, we have me with a very sick horse and a broken arm, and I was down and out. So one morning I woke up, and often I would wake up in tears. On this particular morning, it's like I heard this voice, and it was Christepona. And she said, or they said, you've got to write about this. You've got to make these connections. You don't just get up here and snivel. You've got to write. And because you love to write. I do love to write. You can write. Why don't you write? Why don't you just quit lying there and get up and write? And that was the gist of what Christepona was saying to me. And I realized that this was Bev Harrison talking to me. This was Marianne Hayward, my mother, talking to me. This was Sister Angela saying, darling, write. Get up and write. And so they basically said, we'll tell you what to say. And that's what Christepona is. So in it, I say this book was inspired by my grief and forlornness, really. But I had to try to make connections in it between the highly personal and the very political. So that's what Christepona helps me do. And of course, by the end of the book, it's very clear that Christepona is me, and that Christepona is my higher power. Christepona is my conscience. Christepona is whoever, in all of our lives, whoever those powers are that speak through us or live through us, that we incorporate and they become part of us. That's who Christepona is. So she's me at my best. At least I believe that's who she is. And readers can do with it what they wish. And I'm sure some just put it aside at that point and say, well, this is too weird. This is too weird. Well, it was kind of weird, but it was real, and this went on for months. And then Feather died. That was in November that this happened, and Feather died in April of 2020. And much of what I had written was already written, but not all of it. So the book came to a close, I guess, when COVID. Oh, that's the other thing. COVID comes, you see. Forget about COVID. How can that happen? So COVID comes, and everything is even crazier. And but COVID didn't come to us until I was almost through writing. By March of 2020, I was almost done with this, but not quite. And then Feather died, and I kept writing a little bit.
I don't mean to make fun of this at all, but I hear Sophie Couch in here.
Yeah, and I didn't even think about her at the time, but she's there.
And I want to know, was this truly a mystical experience where you heard a voice?
Well, I don't know. I guess I have to say, Jim, I'm not even sure what a mystical experience is, other than hearing something that was bigger than me. It's not as if I actually saw any human forms or any. I didn't see anybody. It wasn't like and I didn't hear. It was not like talking to another voice back and forth, but it was like. But I knew somehow what was being said to me, and it was not. It was just coming. It was not. I don't know whether it was. It was coming from within me. It was also seen to be coming from all around me. And this was nothing. It was not exactly a new experience, because this is this is often the way I experience, I don't know whether it's prayer or meditation, or like when I'm walking in the woods with my dog Joy, and I suddenly am aware of having a conversation with myself, I guess, with somebody. So I don't know. I don't consider myself exactly a mystic, but then I realize I don't know all that much about mysticism. It's never, social justice has interested me way more as a theologian and as a spiritual seeker, but I've never discounted mysticism. I mean, I do believe that there are these many layers of apprehension, and that we have access to way more than we know.
We're at a point where I promised that we were going to take a break. I'm going to ask you one more question quickly, and then we're going to take about a 10-minute intermission to give everybody a chance to stretch and get a drink of water or whatever, and then we'll come back in about 10 minutes. And during that intermission, we're going to be showing quotes from Carter's books over time. And so you'll have a chance to see some of the other things that she said in writing, and then we're going to come back. We're going to talk more about Tears of Christepona and also about her new book. But I want to ask you about the title. What does Christepona, where did that name come from?
It was a conflation of, and she herself, or they, said, that whoever, when I said, who are you, what are you? They said, we're whoever you need us to be. We're always whoever you need us to be. It's true for anyone. And our names are whatever you need our names to be. And for you, probably, we are both Christ, or your Christic power, and we are Epona, the goddess of horses. I mean, so when we put them together, and you've got a Christic power in horse land. And
and we're going to talk more about your love of horses and what you've done in the second hour. So at this point, we'll take a break. We're going to be gone for about 10 minutes. We'll show you those slides, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, this is going very well, don't you think?
I do. Oh, absolutely. You're perfect. Perfect.
Hey, Royce.
Hey, Royce. Whoops. I was sitting on the table.
Well, how are you doing? Okay. You all been
Recovering
well?
from my surgery, I'm doing good. And you're doing it?
I'm doing fine so far. Betty, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Gift of grace.
Oh,
Yes. Thank you so much. I really look forward to this.
oh, the upcoming book, yeah. I'm testing it out with people at Trinity Presbyterian Church right now, and it's interesting because they are responding. And what they're doing, of course, is saying, well, what do we do about it? And I'm saying, well, I don't have the answer to that question, but that's why I'm raising it, is and I'm speaking specifically, even though I would love to come here and talk about it too, but I'm particularly speaking to Christians, saying, we Christians, have a responsibility to do something about what's happening in this country, because we're part of the problem. We're also part of the solution. It's not that it's all bad, as you know,
Right.
but a lot of it is so bad, and Christians have tended to be quiet. Either part of the problem, the right-wing evangelical stuff, which is not what it's about, really. It's about more mainline Christianity in ways in which we've just sat back and watched them happen.
Yes.
So, I'm hoping we can talk about it with Brevard, and maybe with Christian churches and this church. I mean, you know, and Jewish congregation we all share the problem. Different relationships to it.
We could do a book study.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Sure, that'd be great. Yeah,
Yes.
sure,
Yes, that would be wonderful.
great. I'd be glad to. I mean,
You'd have a big class.
yeah, that'd be great. I'd love that. As long as people know that I'm in the learning mode, that I'm not coming with answers, but with lots and lots of questions.
That's what's so powerful.
Oh. Hello, Kate. I'm doing okay. How are you doing? These are some funny, strange times, aren't they? Oh my God. I neither, and now and this very day, for the first time, I've heard people throughout the media that we listen to, talking about the possibility that we actually might be a no-fly zone, or that there could really be a war involving all of us very soon. And Russia's inviting China into it. Physics. I should have said, there's the one to talk to about physics, because some physicists understand this way better than theologians, like this guy.
Actually, I was going to ask you, have you ever seen Before Sunrise?
No.
So it's, boys on this kind of on the way to Paris. Get off the train. Fly out. Just walk around and talk to each other. Various conversations. It's really wonderful. And the reason I mention it is because at one point they were sitting next to each other and somehow God came up. And she said, I think of God as just something between people. It's just that something between people, just allow them to communicate.
Yes.
The connection. It's very beautiful.
Very, very, very beautiful. Very beautiful. Well, it sounds like I would.
You would.
Before sunset?
Before sunrise.
Before sunrise.
The two actors plus the scriptwriter and the director got together 10 years later and right before sunset. Then they got together again 20 years later and right before midnight.
Wow.
Welcome back. I'm talking with the Reverend Carter Heyward, who is internationally known theologian, Episcopal priest, writer, and activist. And we've been talking quite a bit about how she came to her activism and to her writing, and specifically talking about her latest book, Tears of Christepona. And we just kind of started on that conversation, so I'd like to continue. You talk about the concept of mutuality, and you've mentioned that before, and when we were talking earlier. And you first developed that concept in your book, The Redemption of God, published in 1982. Tell us what mutuality means and why it's central to your theology.
Okay. First of all, mutuality does not mean I scratch your back, you scratch mine. It's which is what often it's heard as, is sort of a tit for tat kind of thing. I always say a mutual relation is one in which all the parties have something important to gain, something that helps them be more who they are or what they can be at their best, so that it's possible for parents and children to have mutuality, for teachers and students, for small nations and large nations, for people who have different amounts of certain kinds of power, that when a relationship is mutual, it's a win-win situation. And that is, I believe, at the heartbeat of what is sacred, of how this sacred power is connecting us. It's when it's...
Is that just another way of saying that God is in all of us?
Yeah, or of describing what love is.
Okay.
Maybe that's really what love is. If I love you, James Baldwin is famous for having said, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And that's a way of talking, I think, about mutuality, of helping raise consciousness with each other. And that is what love is, I believe. And most all of the major religions of the world describe or define God or the sacred as love. If there's any one word that kind of cuts across all religions, it's that.
Yeah. You also use the term godding.
Godding, yes.
And I think that's in the same ballpark here,
It
from
is.
what I understand in your writing. What exactly is godding?
Well, it's a verb, and that's not an original with me. Paul Tillich, Christian theologian, as well as the feminist philosopher Mary Daly, both employed, talked about God as a verb.
Paul Tillich was the death of God person, right?
Not really, no.
Okay.
Well, some people think he was.
Okay.
But I associate, Paul Tillich is the ground of being guy. Okay. He's the one that, he's very sort of an existential theologian who really did talked a lot about being itself and God beyond God and the ground of being. But he believed that to God, or to God in the world, was like to love in the world. And I don't even remember in which book he actually said that. But I believe that God is an active, when I was saying God has that power, that agency is moving the struggles for justice as an activity in God that has to do with acting and not just being a blob.
I remember the Buckminster Fuller quote that God to me is a verb, not a noun.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
You also talk about justice love.
Yes.
It's hyphenated, justice love. Explain what
Yes,
that is, why it's important.
well, that's, I think it was about, sometime in the 1990s or the early 00s, it would have been at least 20 years ago. Presbyterian Church was doing a study on sexuality, and specifically on gay and lesbian sexuality, and they came up with a conservative document that would not allow gay people to be ordained or married. But there was a powerful minority report that was voiced at the time, and the minority voice in this Presbyterian document said that justice and love cannot be separated, that if justice is going to be sustainable, it has to be filled with love, and if love is going to be anything other than a sweet sentiment, it has got to be making justice, and therefore you cannot separate off the two, and so they came up with justice, love as one term. And so I find myself often using that and give thanks to my Presbyterian colleagues. There's one in particular, Marvin Ellison, who was a gay man who's done a whole lot of great gay theology, and he was, I think, the architect of that term.
So these all revolve around the same concept, really.
Yes, they do.
You talk also in the book about time, and you identify chronos time and kairos time, and the implication for our lives between those two things. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Right, and that goes back to Christepona, who is really a creation of kairos. Kairos is, some people talk about it as God's time. I think that differentiates too much between God and us, but I think chronos is the time that we keep here. The time, we're going to end at 8 o'clock, or right now it's 7:15, and that's chronos. So it's the way we order our lives and know what we're doing from one day to the next, and know how old we are and stuff like that. Kairos is this sense of timelessness that is. It sort of lifts us out of chronos, and some people have said that, and this is one of the things COVID has sort of unleashed among us, is we don't know what day it is sometimes. We don't know, we forget appointments because we thought it was Tuesday and actually it's Monday, and there's a sense of sort of being outside of time as we've become accustomed to it. And I do believe that in the sacred movement, that when we talk about death and life being all involved in one another, and the past and the present and the future being all involved with one another, and that the past lives in the present and the future lives in the present, and all of that is a kind of kairotic or kairos understanding of where we are in the universe and in our consciousness. And Christepona came kind of crashing into my chronos with this saying, come on, it's bigger than you realize. And that's kairos.
Would it be fair to say that's the spiritual realm? That
Yeah.
taking us into kairos time takes us into the spiritual?
Yes, if you believe, as I do, that God is this movement among us that is carrying us backward and forward and around, and yes.
And now we're getting into physics too, aren't we?
We are. Royce, our friend Royce out there, we should have him up here talking about physics. We do have a physicist.
In the book, well, let me talk about America's opioid crisis for a minute, which has gripped all of us as we watch people die and suffer from addiction and so on. And it's a subject that's very important to me. I've been speaking on it for a long time because we have treated people so cruelly in this. Anyway, in the chapter titled Hunger, Thirst, and Addiction, you talk about the roots of addiction and how addiction has affected your own life.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that?
I'm a recovering alcoholic. I have been since 1985.
Tell us about the incident that prompted you to stop. You describe in the book.
What do I describe in the book about visiting?
Lying on the floor.
Oh, and my friend Marvin Ellison, the ethicist's house. I had gone up to visit him when my partner Bev and I were looking for a little place that we could buy maybe for summer vacationing in Maine, and Marvin Ellison was teaching ethics at Bangor Seminary, and he was going to have a party for me at his house so that I could meet some of his colleagues, and which was great. So before they came, he and I had supper together and we had wine. And then while we were waiting for them, I had some more wine. And then they came and I had some more wine. And by the end of the evening, I was lying on the floor, kind of asleep or kind of groggy or something. But I remember people stepping over me to leave. This was this party that was in my honor. So the next morning, I was staying in Marvin's guest room, and the next morning we were going to have breakfast together, and then he was going to take me to the airport, and neither he nor I even mentioned what had happened. You know, it was one of these heavy silences. And when I got back to New York, I thought, this has got to stop. I cannot live my life like this. And I felt lucky that I had not done something awful. At least I didn't think I had, you know, either on that occasion or like I had not hit somebody with a car, or I had not killed somebody, or I had, you know, not done things that you hear people doing all the time when they are on substances and are abusing substances. And I easily could have. So it's not that I was above it. I just had not at that time. And so I thought, I've got to stop. So I called a friend of mine, and I was on sabbatical at that time. I had flown back to New York where I was staying with Bear for my sabbatical. So I was living in New York for 4 or 5 months. So I called the one person I knew who was a recovering alcoholic and said, Connie, do you know if there's an AA meeting anywhere around here that I could go to? And this is in Manhattan. And she said, honey, there are 800 meetings a week in New York City. She said, I'll take you to one in the morning. I'll pick you up at 8:30 and we'll go down to 96th Street and Broadway. This was a Catholic church basement. We'll go there. So that's what I did, and that was on October the 11th of 1985. And I had my last drink the night before that. So I have been grateful ever since. And I don't experience my life as having been so troubled and chaotic beforehand that it wasn't worth living. I think I was very lucky. I think I was very lucky that I didn't do terrible things when I was drunk, when I was out of control. But I had fooled myself into believing, for example, that the Redemption of God, which is the book that it's my second book, and it's the book that I refer people to if they want to know if they want to read my work and they want to know where to start. I say start with the Redemption of God, because that's where I lay out the mutuality and all the stuff we've been talking about. Well, I wrote that when I was drinking wine and had a cigarette in one hand and a glass of wine in the other the entire time I was writing it. And I thought at the time I could never do this unless I was drinking wine. I could not accomplish this thing. And I knew when I was writing it, it was important to me at least, and that I believed there was a lot in it that I believed was wise and right. So I was very happy with the Redemption of God, and I still am. I'm really very proud of that book. But I thought for the longest time I never could have done that unless I had been drinking. And now I think that's not true. Now I believe that was my crazy way of thinking. I forget the term in AA, but it's kind of just a mixed up mind. When you're thinking you can't do something unless you've got alcohol to propel you. And
does AA still play a significant part in your life?
Well, I still am very grateful to it. I don't really go very often anymore. But I'm most appreciative to it. I would say it saved my life.
Sure. Let's talk about horses.
Yes.
You talked earlier about, first of all, about taking riding lessons when you were very young, and then being away from it, I think, for decades.
Forever, yeah.
And the book, much of the book is centered on the grief and the agony that you feel as you watch your beloved Feather die. And knowing there's nothing you can do and nothing anybody can do to save her. And she died, I think she was 17,
right,
which is not terribly old
no.
for a horse. So talk about your relationship with Feather and why horses are so special to you.
Well, anybody who loves animals knows something about this. Any animal, any pet, or any wild animal for that matter that you find yourself drawn to or attached to. But I actually think in the chunk of our society that I began to grow up in when I was a child, in the East and in the South, a horse for me when I was a little girl was like this great, powerful animal. And I loved its power, and I loved its sound, and I loved its smell, and being on it was so wonderful and very empowering. You feel like when you're on the horse you can do anything. And then, of course, that had to stop because it was an expensive hobby, as my dad said. I never stopped loving horses, and when my partner and I and our friends moved to the Brevard area we bought land first of all in the mid-90s, and we bought the land right next to a horse stable, and we didn't even know that because I didn't have in my mind at all horses or riding again, much less having horses. So we bought this land and in 1996, and in 2000, this is a long story, I'm going to make it very short. In 2000, word came that the lady through the woods, whom we did not know, wanted to sell her horse farm. And I thought, horse farm? That's what's through the woods, is it? So anyhow, Sue and I, my partner and I, and others of us decided we will make an offer on this farm provided we can figure out what to do with it. And we wanted to do something that would be of some kind of community service. And so in thinking about this, I remembered that I had heard somewhere about therapeutic riding. So I began to research that and discovered that that's really quite a remarkable community resource. And so Free Rein was born. In the purchase of these stables, Free Rein had a home there, had its origins there. I got my first horses, the first horse I got, I couldn't ride because she was too old and too wild. I just loved her to death. Her name was Sugar. Then I needed a horse I could learn to ride on and learn to teach on if I was going to teach at Free Rein. So I got Red, and she was this wonderful horse. And so Red was my own horse, and she was not a Free Rein horse. She was kind of she was my horse, but I used her in my teaching at Free Rein, but she was really my horse. And I really developed a special friendship with her, and then she gave birth to Feather in the year 2003. And Red died in 2013 with a broken leg, which was a terrible and sad thing. But Feather was becoming my sort of really like a soul animal. I would go out every day and groom her and walk her through the woods, either on foot like a dog, or sometimes get on her and ride her around the property. Meanwhile, Free Rein had come down to Camp Rockbrook because it's more space. Now the big arena's there. Free Rein has just taken off, and it's now 22 years old, and it's this great community resource. I just love Free Rein. But my involvement with Free Rein primarily is to raise money for it now. I taught there for 10 years and then took on other roles. I mucked stalls, and I groomed horses, and I helped choose horses, and I helped train horses a little bit. But Red and Feather were my own personal horses, and when Red died and then Feather became increasingly important to me as my soul animal. And I would go out, as I said, every day and spend time with her and did what students at Free Rein do. You talk to the horse, you tell them your secrets, you know that what people who are around horses at all understand is that horses connect with you. They know in a way that humans don't know usually what's going on. They know if you're sad, they know if you're paying attention to them. If you're not paying attention to them and they want you to, watch out. Because they will not put up with that. Now, if they're kind and good, they won't hurt you, but they'll push at you where, like, wait a minute, why are you standing here if you're not going to pay attention to me? I want your attention. So you learn a language with horses. And, you know, you can do this with dogs and cats, but horses are so big, you really have to deal with them. And so
Did you say Feather was a very independent
she was very,
spirit?
yeah, and she was, most people who knew Feather found her to be unfriendly. She wasn't a mean horse, but she really was not a schmoozer. She would not come over to the fence and stand there and nicker at you and love on you. She would with me a little bit, but not, you know, even with me, she was like, you know. So, but I had to, and that's not the kind of horse I would have chosen in the abstract. I would have chosen more of a schmoozer, a horse who would come over and put her head on me. And Feather would keep her counsel and step back from me. But that was so good for me in terms of needing to learn how to navigate that kind of a relationship. So when I found out that she had this horrific cancer, I was devastated, not only because I assumed that I would lose her, but I did not know how I possibly could help her or be with her. I did know that I didn't want her to do chemotherapy because that would have meant she would have had to spend half of her time in the veterinarian hospital. And I wanted her to spend the time she had on our farm, and I wanted to be able to be with her every day, and I wanted to be able to do whatever a vet would have had to do, so that I got the vet to teach me. And I have an awfully good friend here in Brevard, Sandy Thompson. Some of you know Mark and Sandy Thompson, the small animal vet here at Brevard Animal Hospital, and his spouse Sandy is a horse person, and she would come up almost every day and work with me. She was just, you talk about love. I mean, she understands mutuality with horses. She understood mutuality with me, and she really helped me help Feather and helped me nurse Feather to the very end. And meanwhile, we'd be on the phone every day with the vet down in Tryon, who would be giving us both instructions. And even after I broke my arm, I went on down. I broke my left arm, so I could still, and I'm right-handed, so I could still use my dominant arm to do what needed to be done with Feather. So, you know, you're never ready when someone or some creature you love dies. But I was as ready, I guess, as I could be, and she really did not ever have to suffer very much. We let her go when it became apparent that if we didn't, she would start choking to death, and that would not have done it all. So, from my perspective, or from anybody's, and so we had Chris Woodham, the vet, come up from Tryon and put her down.
Free rein has become quite an entity.
It has.
And just coincidentally, there was a really nice article in today's Transylvania Times about free rein and some of the things that are happening, and it's apparently spreading out beyond Transylvania County in a number of ways. So tell us a little bit about what therapeutic riding is and what kind of people you work with. I know you work with children that have autism, for example, and
that's a major population. Not only children, but adults as well, who are on the spectrum. Also, children and adults. I'd say 2/3 of our clientele are children, say 15 and under. And the other third are adults, young adults, older people who have had strokes, who have had heart attacks, who psychologists as well as MDs can refer people to us. Certainly people who have cognitive and physical disabilities like cerebral palsy and muscular dystrophy, and people who have any kind of balance issues or any kind of issues with mobility, or any kind of issues with a manual, with holding on to anything. So often people who've had strokes, adults as well as children. We had one child who had a stroke in utero, who had a terribly hard time with his manual functioning from the time he was born. And so you have to match the child and the horse. You have to kind of match the volunteers and the child and the horse, because and then the instructor and the volunteers and the child and the horse. So it's kind of labor intensive, and it costs a lot of money because horses just cost money. Well, we try to run free rein in the least expensive way possible, of course, but the horses have to eat. People mistakenly believe sometimes that any old horse can be a therapy horse, and that's not true. They have to have certain dispositions. They have to be very patient and very willing with people who are flailing around on them frequently or who are screaming and yelling at them. We don't allow, we being the volunteers and the instructors, don't allow anybody to hit the horses and we try to teach the children and the adults if need be, but usually it's the children you really need to say, no, you don't hit this horse, and here's why. And then you talk about what hitting does and doesn't do, and the difference between, kind of whapping a horse on the shoulder to get it to walk on gently but not hurting it. And it's not like beating the horse. But you have to be very sensitive to the kids, to the adults, and to the volunteers, and the instructors are amazing people. And right now, our board has never been better. I have rotated off the board because I'd been on the board for 20 years, and I decided that's time enough. I will continue to, I'm on sort of an emeritus board now. And so I'll keep raising money, but I wanted to get out of the policy business because...
One of the things the paper said is that I think there are over 100 volunteers now.
I think so. And over its lifetime, there have been like 500 volunteers. And probably 50 different instructors because, people will come as an instructor. You have to get trained and certified, and so usually instructors are there for 5 or 6 years, and then they maybe move, they marry, they leave the county, whatever. But
It's obviously made a real difference here.
it's a good.
I'd like to get into politics now.
Oh, what everybody's waiting for.
Because, well, Tears of Christepona really lays the groundwork
Yes,
for your next book.
it does.
Which is The 7 Deadly Sins of White Christian Nationalism, A Call to Action. And, you begin an examination of the state of America and the world and the human factors that contribute to those problems. In Tears of Christepona, you introduced the term Christofascism.
Yeah.
What is that?
Okay, Christofascism is uniquely American, although I'm sure you can find it other places probably, but not by that name. Dorothea Zola, who was a German woman, born and raised in Germany, was a teenager under Hitler, and she was my primary theological mentor in seminary. And in 1980, when Ronald Reagan came, in 1981, when Reagan came into the presidency, she was one of my teachers at Union, or had been, and by that time I was at Union helping teach some and was there spending my sabbaticals with Bev Harrison, who was on the faculty. And so Dorothea was around a lot, no longer as a teacher, but as a mentor and a friend. And she just said one day to some of us, she said, I'm really worried about Christofascism in America. And that got our attention. And she meant by that using Christ as a fascist tool to further a political authoritarian agenda. And she began to see that happening under the Reagan administration. So this is not a Trump phenomenon. This goes way back to earlier days. And of course, what she saw and what I found out more about when I was writing this book was that by the 1980s, there had already been a merger of the religious right with big business and the political right. These three, I call them an unholy trinity, but this unholy trinity had begun to function. And that's what Dorothea Zola was really naming as Christofascist, using Jesus Christ as a bludgeon to enact authoritarian legislation and agendas. And she began to worry about that in the early 1980s. And so in the seven deadly sins of white Christian nationalism, and in Christepona too, I talk about Christo-fascism as just that, as a force that is here with us. People don't want to talk about fascism and often think of it, well, this is Hitler and this is goose-stepping and this is, Heil Hitler and all of this. That is so wrong-headed. As Shakespeare says, the devil quotes scripture. I mean, fascism doesn't come around looking like it looked in 1940. It comes around in new forms. And I'm not adamant that we should call it fascism, much less Christo-fascism, but because I'm writing my book primarily to Christians, I want the people who read this book, who I believe will be primarily Christians, to think about ways in which Christ has functioned in a fascist mode in the United States of America, really looping back to 1619, looping back to the very beginning when European settlers came and deemed the Native Americans heathens and began to treat them as less than persons. And then, of course, came slaves, chattel slavery, and the demonizing of black people and Native people, and really pretty much everybody except white European males, and over the years. And so, yes, Christo-fascism, or what now we're seeing with Putin and Russia and this horrifically violent authoritarianism, is linked to all of this. I mean, we're all linked to this together. We cannot understand what Putin is really doing there in Ukraine unless we understand what has been happening in our own country. And that's what the 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism tries to illuminate, is these things are happening, and they're happening here, and now we see they're happening everywhere. And so what are we going to do about it?
Well, let's go to the 7 deadly sins. And you state in the prologue, and I'll quote, "This book, from my perspective, is far and away the most important piece I have ever done." Mm-hmm. Tell us why you feel that.
Well, because I think this is a uniquely precarious time in American history, and to be here as Americans in this country at this time, we need to act together in ways that can make a difference to what's going on in our country and in our world. And theology should be a servant to that end. I mean, so any of us who are theologians or ethicists or pastors or priests or rabbis or whatever, or Christian lay people or Unitarian lay people or anybody, we should all be trying to figure out how are we going to make a difference here. And I hope, I don't pretend for a minute that one book by one little person can make all that much difference, but it's sort of the best I can do, and it's not maybe all that I can do, but it's something I can do, and I'm really hoping people will somehow do something, whatever it is people can do, that we need to do it, and as much as possible, coordinate what we're doing so that we're not working at cross purposes.
I'd like to read the list of the 7 sins and have you talk a little bit about that. The first is omnipotence, exercising power over others. Entitlement, assuming we're the best, deserve the most. White supremacy, misogyny, including homophobia. Capitalist spirituality, and I'd like to go back to that.
Oh yeah, I bet. Everybody, that's the hard one.
Domination of the earth and its creatures, and finally, violence. And we don't have time, you devote a chapter to each one of those and explore them in depth, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the central theme of all of that and maybe a little bit on capitalist spirituality.
Yeah, okay, they're all connect. I say that you can't line them up like crayons and see them all as the same, because they have different substances and different shapes, and so you can't exactly compare them. They all interface, they all interact, they each make the others worse. There's no order to them. I mean, violence right now with this war going on, the Presbyterians that I'm meeting with over in Hendersonville saying maybe violence should be number 1. Well, maybe it really should be, but violence certainly interacts, every one of the other sins is violent. So omnipotence and entitlement are kind of in a class of their own, and I kind of call them sins of the human soul. I mean, they're not at all uniquely American. They don't even particularly have uniquely American histories. They're global. But it's that omnipotence, which is actually the opposite of mutuality. It's the power, exercising power over, is the way you are God, or the way you are like God, or the way you are right, or the way you are the father in a family, or for that matter, a dominating mother in a family. I mean, it's gender. It's not gendered, even though it's been primarily played out by men, and is to this day primarily played out by men in a misogynist, patriarchal situation. But omnipotence really, and Christians have projected all of this onto God. You know, the God is this power over us, and that's what I was saying in the last hour. I think is not the case. My friend Dorothy Zola said God cannot be both omnipotent and loving unless you redefine power as love. And then it's not really what we call omnipotence. It's mutuality. So omnipotence, I think, is a huge and problematic sin, and I think Christian churches have a lot to answer for. And not just that, I should say this book is not primarily about right-wing evangelical Christians. It's primarily about mainstream and liberal Christians. It's about all Christians, but it's liberals and mainstream moderate people who will read the book if it's read, and we'll talk about it. But that's really important because it's the liberal mainstream churches and or mainstream churches that have been so quiet for all of our history, just quiet. You know, oh, we don't believe that should be happening, but we don't know what to do about it. It's back to my parents when I ask about colored people. Oh, it's wrong. It's not God's will. What do we do about it? I don't know. There's nothing we can do. Nothing against my beautiful parents personally. They're kind, good, loving people. But nobody was helping them understand that they could do anything about it. And we need to be helping each other understand that, you know, actually we can. I don't know what exactly, but we should do something about this, whatever we have or small. So we have omnipotence, we have entitlement, you know, and what that is. I mean, it's the best, we deserve the most, we're the, whatever is if it's ours, it's best. The best religion, the best God, the best everything. So we've got these two big old deadly sins there. And then we have white supremacy, about which in this society we're talking a lot these days, thank God. And that stands on its own, and it also intersects with everything else. And it's not only American, but it's peculiarly American in terms of the slavery roots and how this has been played out, and to this day is played out in America. Same with misogyny and homophobia, which is Beverly Harrison wrote an excellent essay once talking about misogyny and homophobia being intrinsically connected because they're both about gender and sexuality. And so where you've got anti-women stuff, anti-gay stuff is not far away, and vice versa. So we have misogyny as a deadly sin, cuts through everything. Then you have capitalist spirituality, and I will come back to that because that is the hardest one for most of us to talk about in America because of our fear of socialism and of being called socialist. And look what's happening now in our political realm. And then you have domination of the earth and its many creatures, and in some ways people can make a case for that being the most overarching and the most important, and therefore the first of the deadly sins, what we're doing to the creation, to the earth, and to the earth creatures. And I wouldn't argue with that. Those who want to say that it's got to be our worst sin, go for it. Because certainly it's a huge, enormous one, and it is also connected to all the others. Environmental racism, domination is a power over motif. Forth. And then violence, of course, cuts right through everything like a knife. And so those are the 7 deadly sins. And what I do is I lay them out as best I can, giving examples from Christian theology. And then the last part of the book, which is the last third of the book, I go back to each of the 7 deadly sins and talk about what Christian congregations and other groups of people might think about doing with some study questions and here are some possibilities. with each of these sins. So that, and for Christians, I use parables and I use Jesus stories and I use parts of the Bible to try to illustrate what we might do. So capitalist spirituality, is funny you asked me to talk about that, Jim, because when I asked the Presbyterians, I said, okay, we have time only to do one deadly sin in this course. Which one? Capitalist spirituality. So that's what I've got to prepare for Sunday. Anyhow, it is the hardest one to talk about because we're so terrorized by being called socialists and by knowing that if we are branded as socialists, we will lose in a capitalist situation. And our country is so profoundly and thoughtlessly capitalist in the worst sense. And I try in this book to talk about the difference between what Adam Smith envisioned, which was a chicken in every pot, if you will, and the ability of people not to have to be under feudal lords, but rather to be able to make their own living and to take care of their own families, and they being white English men, of course, Scottish men, actually Adam Smith, but white European men. But even if you extend that to women, it's the individual family, his well-being, and this was at the time a revolutionary concept, early capitalism. Well, it's morphed into a horrific earth-eating, people-eating monster, because it's no longer that at all. There's no such thing really as private enterprise anymore. Look what happens in most cases when little stores get gobbled up by the big conglomerates, when little businesses have to fall by the wayside. Look what happened to Mission Hospital. I mean, look what happens all around us all the time when conglomerates come in and gobble up what good American men and women are trying to do to make a living. And then look at salaries. Look at the disparity between Jeff Bezos and the people who work for Amazon, and so forth and so on. So capitalism has become this monster that is no longer, bears no relation to what we think of as capitalism. Where capitalism needs to be critiqued, and I would say needs to be critiqued by Christians and other religious people, is in the utter selfishness of believing that whatever is mine, and I do not have to, I'm under no obligation morally or spiritually to share it with anyone else. Even if I have 1,000 times more than you have and you are starving and you are on the streets, I have no obligation whatsoever to share with you from my largesse. That is the evil of advanced global capitalism, that people can get richer and richer and richer and think of it as theirs and theirs only, and don't feel any spiritual obligation to share it. This is where Christians, as Bishop Tutu once said, I don't know what Bible Christians are reading, when they start talking about things like this, because the New Testament is very clear about this. This is one of the places where Jesus and his followers do not equivocate about sharing what we have, and about giving to the poor, and about Christians sharing what they have in common. And even if they are talking as people who want to sort of figure out how else to interpret that, will say, well, they just mean Christians share with each other, things like that. Maybe, maybe not. But the parable of the rich young ruler is not about that. The parable of the rich young ruler is about selling what you have and giving the profits to the poor. There are not many ways to get around that parable, actually, except for just ignoring it. Ignore it, throw it away, say, well, now he says a lot of other things too. Let's talk about the other things. But I mean, and this is what Christians have to wrestle with. What do we do about this? And I am sorry that one of our two political parties has lost its soul on this issue, and most of the others as well, I must say. My father was a Republican. My good, kind Christian father was a Republican, so I'm not anti-Republican, but I'm very much anti what that party stands for right now, particularly in its far right wing that has attached itself to Donald Trump. I mean, this is greed, this is selfishness, this is narcissism, This is anti-everything that Christians and Unitarians and other people of faith should be standing for, and we just need to find ways of coming out about that and not being quiet and not worrying about ruffling people's feathers. You know, I think it's possible, and I'm going to try this with the Presbyterians on Sunday, it's possible to say, you know, you don't have to agree with anything I'm saying, but can we at least talk about it? You know, you don't have to be a Democrat like I am to have a conversation with me about values. Let's talk about what we value. Let's talk about what it means to share what we have. Can't we talk about these things? And this is the way I think it begins in congregations. Not so much this congregation, which I may have an overly idealized view of you all as not needing to talk about some of this as much as some other people, but that's probably not true, because we probably all need to talk about it and think about it, because who knows what to do about this? Very few, if any of us do. But that's capitalist spirituality.
Well, we're almost out of time, and there is so much more we could have covered here tonight.
It's true.
So maybe you'll come back and join us sometime.
Well, the Rabs here and Betty were suggesting that maybe there could be a book study of the 7 deadly sins here. I would love that. That'd be very cool.
I'd like to, if there's anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question, I'll give you an opportunity to do that. But before we do that, Carter, I'd like you to end this with the way you end the 7 deadly sins, with a story about a meeting between Desmond Tutu and Sue Hyatt.
Yes.
Most people know who Desmond Tutu was, but I don't know how
This
many
was
people
so
know who
wonderful.
Sue Hyatt is.
Sue Hyatt was the woman that was hired, the woman priest ordained in Philadelphia. In fact, she was the organizer of the Philadelphia ordination among the women. Fabulously brilliant social strategist, and she and I were hired by the Episcopal Divinity School, so we were there together as priests for all those decades. Well, in 2001, she came down with an anaplastic thyroid tumor, which is terminal, and she was only supposed to live for like a month, but she lived for like a year and a month, and she was in a hospice in Watertown, Massachusetts. At the very same semester that Desmond Tutu was a visiting scholar at the Episcopal Divinity School where Sue and I had taught. And Tutu lived in the same building where Sue and I had apartments. And so we had gotten to know him as a neighbor. And Sue asked me if I would get him to come out and bless her in the hospice. I said I certainly would ask him, and so I went and asked him, and he said yes, and asked me if I would take him, and I said yes, I would. So I tried to prepare the staff at the hospice for the fact that Bishop Tutu was going to come and visit with Sue Hyatt. And mind you, most of the staff was African American. And so there was great excitement that Bishop Tutu was going to come to the hospice. And we got there, and it was like the parting of the Red Sea. Everybody just stepped aside when Bishop Tutu walked in, and he was not dressed as a bishop. He was dressed just like we are now. And but I took him into Sue's room, and when he walked in, Sue pointed up to the top of her closet where a Desmond Tutu doll stood that had been given to Sue by one of her South African students. And it was a bishop in a purple cassock and a little and white hair and little glasses and his same little smile, and it looked just like him, except for it was about 12-inch doll, and he chortled and I chortled, and he said, "Oh, I know who made that. I know who made it." And so anyhow, then she said, "Would you sing for me?" And he said, "Well, I don't sing." And she said, "Please, would you sing?" And he looked around at me and he said, "Well, would you sing with me?" And I said, "Well, depends on what you're saying." And so then it was ironic because he said, "Let's sing the Gloria Patri," which is the glory be to the Father, right? So Sue and I had been working for 30 years to try to get rid of that exclusive language, but we all sat there and sang the Gloria Patri, of course, and that was very sweet and very moving. And then he finished singing that, and we did too. And then he told us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Sue asked him to discuss that, so he told us about that, and he was still the chair of it at the time. He was just on sabbatical. And then it was about time for him to leave, and so she said, "Will you bless me?" And he did. And I don't know what he said to her exactly. I was trying to give them space, so I stood back. But he blessed her, and then he asked her, "Would you bless me?" Mutuality. And so she did. And so then, as he and I got ready to leave, we were walking out the door, and she said, in a voice that was very weak by then, "You give me hope that the truth will go on. You give me hope that the truth will go on." So he and I went out to the car. We got in the car, and we drove about 5 or 10 minutes back to the seminary parking lot. Total silence. Complete silence. It was so sad. It was also so beautiful. So moving. And then when we got into the parking lot, we hugged each other, and each went to our own apartment, and that was that. But Sue died several days later. And as we know, Desmond Tutu only recently died. But that was a very special moment.
And a fitting
Yeah.
end to this.
Fitting end, yes.
Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? We have just a little bit of time left. I'll give you an opportunity. Okay.
Peter,
I'll ask,
Please come up to the microphone.
I'm shout real good, but I'll come up to the mic. They can't hear you online.
This is sort of a non sequitur, but as you talked about Feather, you talked about bringing her down. You didn't use that language.
putting her down, yeah.
Talk about that for us for a brief moment.
About what that was like for me, or what, about her death?
Yes,
Yes.
because you obviously engaged a veterinarian
Yes.
to bring her life to a grace-filled end.
Yes,
Talk about that for us.
okay,
Humans.
yes. Peter, just let me ask you one question. Are you asking me to specifically talk about what that was like for me?
No,
But
I
what-
want you to talk about that in the context of human
Humans,
life.
okay. That's what I wondered, okay. Yeah, I mean, I have said many times, and I dare say many of you have too, that I think we do treat our animals with more respect at the end than we do humans so often, when there is such something so sad going on, and the loss of the capacity to continue to live without pain, without suffering, without any quality whatsoever of life, by the person's own definition. I believe strongly that we should be able to die, that we should be able to choose our death. I don't think it should be, I think there has to be guardrails. I don't think it should just be a free-for-all. But I think that with a lot of careful attentiveness, that should be allowed, from as it is, and as you know, in certain states and certainly in certain countries around the world. I have a friend who went to the Netherlands for her mother to be euthanized. So yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything sadder than losing a loved one in that way, just in terms of pure sadness, but also gratitude that you have that option, as I did with Feather. I mean, people say it's only a horse. Well, yes, it was only a horse, but it's my horse. It was my dear friend Feather, and I was so glad that she could have an easy death, and I would wish that for every one of us and those whom we love.
Carter Heyward, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It has been truly an enriching experience. Thank you for your candor and for all you have done to and continue to do to make the world a better place. In spite of all the troubles around us, you give us hope.
Thank you, Jim, so much, and thank you all for coming here. You've sat there for a long time. Thank you for coming.
And I'd also like to thank Catherine Burley and Doug Wilkes, who did our
Yes.
sound, and all of you who have joined us. We hope you'll join us again in April for our next installment of the UUTC Author Series. I'm Jim Hardy. Good evening.
Thank you, Jim. You do such a great